Hello everyone and welcome once again back to ThursDev. I am your host Luke, and today we're going to take another look at an old classic, one of my favorites from the NES era, Final Fantasy. This episode was inspired by the recent speedrun by some of my favorite speedrunners, Feasel and Gyre, at the Awesome Games Done Quick 2017 marathon, which ended earlier this month. If you want to see the mechanic I described today used to astounding effect, I suggest wholeheartedly that you watch the Final Fantasy run on YouTube from AGDQ 2017, which I'm linking in a card above and will also at the end of this video, and in the description below. Feasel, Gyre, and Puexel do a fantastic job during the run of explaining how today's mechanic works in far more detail than I will have time to get into in this one video, so consider this the Cliff's Notes version thereof, and get a bag of popcorn and a comfortable chair and go watch their run. Every minute of the 4 hours within is worth watching. I would also note that much of the information in today's video is gathered from a fantastic FAQ written by a GameFAQs user called Astral Esper, which I also will link below, that goes into detail about today's topic in their Section 6, Battle Formulas, as well as a plethora of other information which I may also use as topics for future game design breakdown episodes, as well as the fantastic resource for Final Fantasy on tasvideos.org. With that stated, today we'll be talking about how Final Fantasy created the illusion of randomness in its encounter system, a simple solution to a complex problem that, though exploitable now 30 years later, creates a compelling play experience that was an integral part to kicking off a series of games that would go on to define a genre. Long before it was a boy band road trip movie about angsty teenagers cooking food and taking selfies, Final Fantasy got its humble beginnings on the Famicom as a reasonably generic fantasy role-playing game based loosely on Dungeons & Dragons. Between snippets of plot told to the players through the opening screen of the game and sparse lines of dialogue from NPCs, it was a game about exploration and strategic combat. With the exception of the game's villages and most of its castles, the player would, while walking around, occasionally be torn out of the game map and made to engage in a combat sequence. By selecting commands from a window, the player would be able to tell their party of 4 characters what to do in combat, and after all commands had been issued, the battle would commence and the outcome would appear to be determined. The entire game could, with confidence, be said to center around this singular set of intertwined mechanics. Combat included a number of interesting monsters and, as is the way with any RPG with so-called random encounters, a fair amount of unpredictability that makes the game challenging. This unpredictability, as it turns out, however, is not so unpredictable at all in the case of Final Fantasy. Though there's no way that 30 years ago we consumers would have been able to really truly fathom how the game systems worked, it turns out that all of the game's combat mechanics are very tightly controlled by a surprisingly small number of tables. From the moment the player turns on the game to the moment that the game is completed, the player is actually doing little more than advancing the values on these tables, which have enough variance to appear random, and getting appropriate results as defined on the table. The easiest place to observe these randomness tables in action is to learn about what's known as the step counter. Let's take a quick look at the game's memory, specifically at address 00F100 in the game's memory, where there's a static block of 256 numbers that defines how often the player will reach an encounter in combat. This block of values is constant in every copy of the USA edition of Final Fantasy, which means that if you know how this table works, you'll know exactly when you'll reach an encounter in the game. In the case of the encounter step table, when the game is first loaded from a clean boot, it starts at the first value, 1F. If the game detects that the player is on a tile that generates quote-unquote random encounters, it advances to the next value. Each time the player takes a step on an encounter-enabled tile, this value cycles up through the values until it encounters a number that is less than an encounter threshold value. Once it sees a number less than its threshold, it tells the game to trigger a random encounter. If we're to visualize this, that means that the following values are encounters. Every step advances through the values until it hits a number that's less than its encounter threshold. On the overworld, that's set to any number below 10. In this case, that would be the 16th entry or 15th step since we start at value 1F, and combat ensues. Regardless of the outcome of combat, the step counter continues soldiering along. 19 more steps later we reach our second encounter, and then 27 steps after that, another encounter. This memory stays active during the entire play session, and even if the player were to reset, say after the third encounter, the position in the memory would remain the same and generate another encounter after 11 more steps. You can try it yourself. Only bear in mind that there are certain tiles, even in the overworld, that don't generate encounters, like a number of the tiles directly below the entrance to the city of Canaria, tiles containing a dock or any village tile, or damage tiles like lava in the fire and earth caves. The threshold is dependent on certain criteria. On an ocean tile, it only generates encounters at values below 3, and in dungeons, 8, with the exception of the Sky Palace's 5th floor, where Tiamat resides with the infamous Warmech, with an aggressive threshold of 24 or lower, and the various elemental floors of the past version of the Temple of Fiends, with thresholds of 9 to 12 respectively. The encounters the game generates are further defined by the location the player is walking through when the encounter is generated. A number of large square areas on the overworld define what kind of encounters you're going to get. It's defined by floors in dungeons. In the very first area, on the land surrounding Canaria Castle, encounters are a combination of imps, grey imps, wolves, and about a 5% chance of a mad pony, as per its position on the encounter table. The encounter table is also a static value, which determines which of 8 possible configurations of opponents you'll face, which increments for each battle fought. The encounter configurations are not evenly distributed, with 4 having 48 instances each along the table, configurations of 5 and 6 having 24 instances each, configuration 7 having 12, and configuration 8 having a measly 4 out of the 256 available slots on the encounter configuration table. This makes configuration 8 feel like an exceedingly rare encounter, even though when it happens it's always fixed to occur 4 times at specific intervals within every 256 encounters. These encounters are predictable to a point. The table tells us that we'll get configuration 3, 4, 3, 6, 2, 2, 7, and onward, so we can predict what enemies we'll face and when, but each configuration further has a more pure random value determining what actually appears in the encounter. So we'll always face 3 to 5 imps in our first encounter, but we can't be sure whether it will be 3, 4, or 5 without knowing yet another value, which increments in a much less predictable manner. Still, this can be an amazing tool. If the player so desires, for example, when they get to the town of Provoca and gain the ship, they can save at the inn, then every time they leave the city and enter the water, they know that their 76th valid step, as the step table encounter threshold is lower on the ocean, they will encounter the 3rd configuration of ocean enemies for the area, up to 5 Kaizoku, which are a low threat enemy with high payout. They can farm gold with this guaranteed Kaizoku encounter, and then return to town, save again, turn off the power, and turn it back on again to set the encounter table back to its default values, and repeat ad infinitum until they have the amount of money that they want. By using these predefined encounters at predefined steps, speedrunners and game strategists have been able to optimize the way that they play the game in amazing ways, turning a game that was once considered far too dangerous to speedrun into a simple numbers game, using resets at encounters to maintain their encounter configuration position and step count to ensure that their route puts them against manageable enemies every step of the way. In a game like Final Fantasy, the randomness is one of the major contributing factors to difficulty. Of course, 30 years ago, the knowledge of how the encounter system works was hidden within the ROM and unable to be accessed by the layman, but this sort of manipulation of randomness, or RNG, that isn't truly random can lead to some exploitability, as we can see in the present day. Of the same era, there were other RPGs that also implemented random encounters, but were significantly harder to predict due to incrementing their encounter table per tick, for example, while the game is being played and not stopping per step, like in Dragon Warrior. But ultimately, Final Fantasy's encounter system was functional and elegantly simple without being taxing on the very limited processing power of the NES and Famicom. Today, randomness is significantly more random, and though some table manipulation can be done, it's generally thought to be much more difficult to control the RNG of a game like this. But Final Fantasies was a game of many interesting compromises, and a great many bugs. Next week, I'd like to continue our lighthearted trip down memory lane with Final Fantasy by exploring some of the bugs that you may not have even known about, which, if you ever do decide to try the game again yourself, may just help you out. Until then, however, thank you as always for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this little episode of ThursDev. If there's a game design topic that interests you that you'd like to hear about in the future, I'm always open to suggestions, though I always also have plenty up my sleeve. But that's all for today. Once again, thank you for coming by, and until next time, take care.